Hello, my name is Inez. I am 66 years old and I want to share a story that changed my life forever. My adopted black son risked everything to save our lost dog during a brutal snowstorm. He went out into the storm without hesitation, despite the danger. And while he brought our beloved dog back safely, he ended up gravely ill. When we rushed him to the hospital, my husband's reaction froze me to the core. He sneered, "Your son and that useless dog should have died out there. All they ever do is drain my life." What he didn't realize is that it's my son and my dog who quietly bankroll his pampered, worthless existence. The cruelty of his words lit a fire in me I could not ignore. That very night, I signed the papers that would leave him broke, powerless, and finally facing the consequences of his actions. Every choice I made after that was about protecting my family, ensuring Kevin's recovery, and teaching my husband a lesson he would never forget. The tension, the secrets, and the clever steps I took to safeguard my son and our dog turned our lives into a carefully orchestrated plan for justice. But there were twists and betrayals along the way that even I didn't see coming. How did a single act of bravery from my son lead to such a dramatic reversal? And how did a loyal husky play a part in it all? There's so much more to this story than what I've shared here. But before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. I truly love reading your comments and knowing where you come from. Now let's understand how this story really began. The winter had a cruel way of settling into the bones. A relentless chill that seeped into every corner of the house and lingered like a silent accusation. 5 years had passed since I lost my first husband, and although the pain had dulled, it had never disappeared. A year ago, I had remarried. I told myself I was seeking companionship, someone to share the quiet moments, someone to feel warmth beside in the long, dark evenings. But as I now stood at the edge of Kevin's hospital room, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, I realized how wrong I had been about Greg. Kevin lay pale under the harsh hospital lights, his body trembling against the blanket, oxygen tubes snaking from his nose to the machine beside his bed. Even in his weakened state, there was a stubborn dignity in his expression, a quiet bravery that had always defined him. My adopted son, my heart outside my chest, had risked everything for our dog, Tim, during a snowstorm that had painted the world white and treacherous. I had been terrified when I received the call. My mind had conjured every horrible scenario possible. I had prayed, more desperately than I ever had before, that both would come back safe. Tim had returned, unharmed, tail wagging despite the snow clinging to his thick fur. Kevin, however, had not been so fortunate. He had caught a severe infection from the cold, one that had left him frail and nearly lifeless. Greg was at my side, or so it seemed. His hand brushed mine briefly in the sterile hospital corridor, but there was no warmth there, only a calculated formality. As the nurse adjusted Kevin's blanket, Greg leaned toward me, his voice barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to pierce the numbness in my chest. "Your son and your dog should just die already, instead of just draining my life," he muttered, eyes cold, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. My stomach turned. The words were like ice shards embedded in my chest. I looked down at Kevin, his pale face still showing the faint remnants of a smile he tried to muster for me. Then my eyes traveled to Greg, who was tapping his expensive watch, waiting, impatient, as though our son's very life was an inconvenience to him. I felt something ignite within me, a fire tempered by years of loss and resilience. My late husband's will flashed in my mind, a document I had read countless times, though I never imagined needing it to protect against someone I had allowed into my home. He had been meticulous, almost prophetic in his understanding of human nature. The inheritance was contingent on our unity. I, Kevin, and Tim. The clause was simple, yet elegant. As long as we remained a family, the fortune, the house, the the life we lived, all of it was ours. Any fracture, any betrayal or abandonment, and the majority of the wealth would flow to a charitable foundation. It had been designed to safeguard the legacy of love and family he believed in, even beyond his death. And now Greg, in his arrogance and cruelty, threatened to undo what we had fought to preserve simply for his own satisfaction. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat, my pulse thundering in my ears. Kevin coughed softly, the sound cutting through the fog of my fury, and I bent closer, brushing a strand of damp hair from his forehead. His eyes met mine, wide and trusting despite the pain and exhaustion that weighed down every movement. He didn't know the full extent of Greg's intentions yet, but I would not let him see my fear. Not today. Not ever. "You're going to be okay, my brave boy," I whispered, my hand over his. "Tim's waiting for you at home. We'll get through this together." Greg, for his part, continued his posturing, straightening his jacket and adjusting his tie as though he were preparing for a photo op rather than standing in a hospital where a child fought for his life. I felt a cold, icy hand grip my spine. This man had no empathy, no sense of what was right. But he underestimated me. He underestimated the depth of love that had been forged in loss, the bond between a mother, her child, and the dog who had been our silent guardian. Tim was more than a pet. He was the living, breathing emblem of the trust, the unspoken pillar upon which our fortune and future rested. Greg did not see him for what he was, nor did he recognize that every cruel word, every impatient glance, every small act of malice would be met with calculated resistance. That night, I sat alone in the hospital cafeteria, the fluorescent lights harsh but comforting in their steadiness. Greg had gone to fetch coffee, leaving me to wrestle with my thoughts, my fear, my anger, and my determination. I pulled a pen from my bag and laid it across the surface of the table, its metallic weight grounding me. My mind replayed every instance of Greg's arrogance, every sneer, every suggestion that Kevin and Tim were liabilities rather than family. The pen hovered above a document that would change everything, a legal maneuver, carefully drafted and reviewed that would ensure Greg would never hold power over us again. My hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the profound gravity of what I was about to do. Signing it would not be revenge for its own sake. It would be justice, protection, and the reclamation of everything that mattered. As I signed, I felt the ink seep into the paper, a quiet assertion of my resolve. I imagined the look on Greg's face when he realized, too late, that he was no longer the master of this house, no longer the one in control. He would learn that cruelty, malice, and greed could never overpower love, loyalty, or the unbreakable bonds that tie a family together. Tim, my faithful guardian, would continue to stand watch. Kevin, resilient and courageous, would recover. And I, Inez, would ensure that no man, no matter how charming or assertive, would ever compromise the safety, dignity, or happiness of those I loved. Greg returned, oblivious, his smile forced and superficial, carrying the coffee as though it were a peace offering. He did not yet know that the game had changed, that his moves would be anticipated, countered, and ultimately nullified by the quiet, steady hand of a woman who refused to yield to fear or cruelty. I met his gaze, calm and composed, masking the whirlwind inside me. He was about to learn a lesson in humility and consequence, one that would unfold not in anger, but in the relentless, unwavering strength of a mother protecting her family. And in that moment, as I watched him sip his coffee, completely unaware, I felt a profound sense of clarity and purpose. For the first time in years, I knew that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one I was about to unleash, and that it would be fought not with malice, but with love, strategy, and the unbreakable bonds of family. A week later, we brought Kevin home. The snow had softened into gray slush along the driveway, as if winter itself were exhausted from taking so much from us. Kevin's body looked smaller in the wheelchair, diminished by illness in a way that felt profoundly unfair. A thin oxygen tube rested beneath his nose, the quiet hiss of the machine punctuating the silence of the car ride. I kept my hand on his knee the entire way, grounding myself in the warmth of his skin, reminding myself that he was here, that he had survived. Greg played his role flawlessly in front of the doctors. He nodded at every instruction, asked performative questions, even placed a hand on Kevin's shoulder with a practiced expression of concern. Anyone watching would have thought him a devoted husband and stepfather, burdened but noble. I watched him closely, memorizing the angles of his face, the way his eyes never quite softened. The moment we crossed the threshold of our home and the door clicked shut behind us, his mask slipped. His shoulders relaxed, his mouth twisted into irritation, and the air in the room changed, thicker, colder, heavier. Kevin's breathing grew shallow as the unfamiliar silence settled around him. I guided the wheelchair carefully across the rug, speaking softly, narrating every small movement as if my voice alone could shield him from exhaustion. That was when Tim appeared. He had been waiting near the stairs, ears alert, eyes sharp. The instant he saw Greg step closer to Kevin, something primal awakened in him. Tim moved without hesitation, placing his body squarely between Greg and the wheelchair. A low growl vibrated from his chest, not loud, not wild, but deliberate. A warning, Greg scoffed. "Get this filthy animal out of my way," he snapped, irritation flaring across his face. He lifted his foot and made a sharp, careless motion toward Tim's side. Time seemed to slow. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Don't touch him," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Inside, I was shaking. Years of politeness, of compromise, of swallowing discomfort rose up and burned away in that single sentence. Greg froze, then laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed through the room. "Always with the dog," he said. "Your soft heart will be the death of you." He had no idea how wrong he was. He saw fur and inconvenience. I saw loyalty, instinct, protection. He didn't know that Tim was more than family. He didn't know that this dog standing firm, unyielding, was one of the 3 pillars holding up the life Greg so shamelessly enjoyed. The tailored suits, the sports car, the dinners he bragged about, none of it belonged to him. It was all built on a bond he was actively trying to destroy. Kevin reached out weakly and rested his fingers against Tim's fur. Tim leaned into the touch, instantly gentle, his growl fading into a quiet vigilance. I felt tears sting my eyes, not from fear, but from the overwhelming contrast between cruelty and devotion playing out in front of me. The afternoon stretched on in fragments. I helped Kevin settle into bed, adjusted his oxygen, kissed his forehead, and promised him I wasn't going anywhere. Then I went to the kitchen and began making soup, chopping vegetables slowly, deliberately, as though each movement were an anchor keeping me from drifting into rage. The familiar rhythm steadied my hands, but my ears strained toward Greg's office. His door was closed, but his voice carried. "Yes, liquidating some assets makes sense," he said, tone casual, almost bored. "She won't notice. And the boy, he shouldn't be here long term. A facility would be cleaner." I stopped stirring. My breath caught painfully in my chest as realization settled over me like a lead blanket. This wasn't just resentment. This wasn't impatience. It was strategy. Greg wasn't merely unkind, he was methodical. He was planning to erase Kevin from our home, from our lives, as if love were an inconvenience and family a technicality to be managed away. I turned off the stove before the soup could burn. My hands were trembling now, anger threading itself through every vein. Tim padded into the kitchen and sat beside me, his presence quiet but absolute. I knelt and pressed my forehead against his, breathing him in the warmth. The familiar scent. The steady reassurance of a creature who did not need words to understand what was at stake. "They think we're weak," I whispered, my voice breaking despite myself. "They think love makes us easy to dismantle." Tim's tail thumped once against the floor. I stroked his fur slowly, feeling my pulse begin to calm, my thoughts sharpen. Fear had its moment, but it didn't get to stay. Something stronger took its play. Clarity. Resolve. A fierce protectiveness that had been forged in loss and tempered by endurance. "We have work to do, boy," I murmured. He lifted his head and looked at me, eyes bright, unwavering. In that quiet exchange, no promises were spoken, yet everything was understood. Kevin rested in the next room, fighting his way back to strength. Tim stood guard, silent and loyal. And I no longer confused, no longer willing to hope my way out of danger, felt something shift inside me. This house would not be dismantled. This family would not be erased. And the people who believed otherwise had no idea how much strength lived in silence. Greg came into the kitchen that morning with that infuriating, practiced smile. The one he used when he wanted to appear benevolent while plotting chaos behind it. His eyes flicked toward me briefly as though checking that I was still presentable, still compliant, still human. Then he spoke, his words dripping with feigned concern. "I've arranged for someone to help with Kevin, a private nurse. It'll relieve some of your burden," he said, like it was a gift, like he was saving me from the exhaustion of caring for my own child. I felt a cold pang, a subtle tightening in my chest. There was a charm in the way he framed it, but I knew better. I had learned enough about Greg's gestures over the past weeks to understand that they always came with strings, always with an agenda. The nurse's name was Linda, he said, young, professional, impeccably put together. She had a measured smile, the kind that seemed polite from a distance, but carried a chill when it landed too close. I met her once when she arrived. Linda's gaze lingered on Kevin for a heartbeat too long, the corners of her eyes cold, assessing him not as a boy in need of care, but as a project, an object, a means to an end. My son's frailty should have been enough to elicit tenderness from anyone with a shred of decency. Instead, it felt as though she weighed his weakness and found it inconvenient. She nodded to me, polite, professional, yet utterly devoid of warmth. And I knew immediately, with the quiet certainty that comes from years of watching human nature, that she was not here simply to help. Tim, as ever, sensed what I couldn't yet articulate. The moment Linda approached Kevin's room, his body stiffened, his hackles rising, his low growl vibrating like a warning under the floorboards. Every step she took toward Kevin was met with a bark, insistent and unwavering, until I would rush to intervene. It was exhausting to run back and forth, to keep the peace, to soothe my son and reassure my dog. And yet, I couldn't ignore what Tim was telling me. This woman was not safe. Something about her presence disturbed the delicate balance we had fought so hard to restore. One evening, I found myself cleaning up after Kevin, gathering the small piles of trash that had accumulated around his bed. A discarded receipt caught my eye, crumpled but legible. It was from a steakhouse, 2 dinners, the date coinciding with the night. Greg claimed he was working late. My stomach tightened. Greg and Linda were not strangers. They were partners. Partners in what, I couldn't yet say. But my instincts screamed that it was not care or concern for Kevin. The realization hit me with the subtle force of inevitability. They were manipulating him, weakening him, ensuring he remained pliable, compliant, too ill to resist. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with a growing, icy resolve. My son, my child, had already suffered enough. He had risked his life to save Tim, to protect what was ours. And here was a man, my husband, scheming to strip him of strength and autonomy, all for the sake of greed and control. Normally, kindness is my compass. I hesitate, I weigh, I search for mercy even in those who don't deserve it. But the sight of Kevin sedated, his delicate body slumped with exhaustion, the life dimming behind his eyes in response to drugs, ignited something lethal in me. Not rage that screams, but calculated determination, the quiet type that leaves no escape for those who threaten the vulnerable. That night, I acted. I swapped Kevin's medication with placebos, carefully, meticulously, ensuring that while Greg and Linda believed they were in control, they were not. The boy would wake with his mind clear, his body no longer at their mercy. The next morning dawned bright and deceptively calm. I moved through the kitchen with the practiced grace of a woman who knows exactly what she holds. Kevin was resting, his eyes fluttering open with the hint of life returning to them. Tim padded beside me, his gaze alert, ears twitching at every sound. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, subtle and electric, the quiet before the storm of justice I was about to unleash. Greg entered shortly thereafter, Linda following with the crisp efficiency of someone convinced of their own righteousness. They both assumed I was oblivious, still the compliant, grateful wife and mother. I smiled at them, poured coffee into delicate cups, the steam curling up like the fingers of a gentle hand reaching for them, unaware that the warmth it promised masked a bitter, inevitable truth. I could feel my pulse steady, the calm rhythm of a storm contained, and the weight of history and morality pressing me forward. As I handed Greg his cup, I met his eyes with the softest, sweetest expression I could muster. It was the smile of a woman who had suffered, who had loved without reservation, who had watched cruelty unfold and decided it would not touch the ones she cherished. He did not know that every sip would taste of failure, that every confident glance toward Linda would meet the consequences of their deception. I watched him lift the cup, saw the faint crease in his brow as he caught the faintest note of defiance in my smile. And in that moment, I understood the depth of what we had built together, not just a family surviving illness, but a bond fortified by trust, loyalty, and love. Kevin stirred in the background, his eyes brighter, alert to the world again. Tim sat proud, vigilant, a sentinel guarding the fragile balance of our lives. And I, standing between the innocence of my son and the betrayal of the man I had married, felt a fierce, unyielding clarity. They thought they were in control. They thought my compassion would blind me to their plans, but they had underestimated a mother's love, the silent language of loyalty, and the quiet but unbreakable bond between a boy, a dog, and the woman who would protect them at any cost. Today, the game had shifted. Today, they would taste not just bitterness, but the inevitable unraveling of every scheme they believed secure. I had spent the night lying awake in my bedroom, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft, steady rhythm of Tim's breathing as he curled at the foot of my bed. Kevin was asleep in the next room, his chest rising and falling with the quiet promise of recovery. And Greg was oblivious, as always, convinced of his own cleverness, convinced that I was still the fragile, compliant woman he had married. That misconception would be his undoing. I rose early, moving through the house with deliberate slowness. Each step calculated, each gesture exaggerated to fit the image I wanted to project. I allowed the slightest tremor to my hands as I walked past Greg, letting him see the frailty he so desired. "Where did I put the checkbook?" I asked aloud, letting my voice waver just enough to seem genuine. I can never remember where I leave anything these days. Greg's eyes lit up with smug satisfaction. "Let me help, dear," he said, stepping closer, his tone a mixture of condescension and self-congratulation. "These forms are complicated. I'll take care of it." He was smiling, completely unaware that I had orchestrated this scene precisely to ensnare him. I handed him a stack of documents, deliberately leaving the more important ones at the bottom, as if by accident, while keeping the true control in my hands. As he began to manipulate the papers, transferring small amounts of money under the guise of taking care of family matters, I kept my phone hidden in my knitting bag. Each alert blinked softly against the dark fabric, and I recorded every transaction in my mind, cataloging every misstep, every greedy assumption. Greg's arrogance, his belief that I would never notice, was his blind spot, and it was precisely what I relied upon. Outside, the world was muffled under a thin blanket of snow, the yard pristine except for Tim's keen eyes and sharp nose. He had begun to patrol methodically, sniffing the edges of the property, moving in patterns that I had come to understand as both instinctual and remarkably intelligent. When he returned a little later, his tail wagged faintly, his body tense with purpose, and I followed him to the backyard. There he had unearthed a plastic bag buried shallowly beneath the soil, as though he had been guided by some silent whisper of intuition. Inside, the papers rustled, yellowed with age, and my heart caught as I recognized the contents: drafts of a power of attorney, crudely signed and manipulated, a document Greg had thought destroyed. I sank to my knees on the cold earth, the snow melting into my coat, and sifted through the papers with trembling hands. The plan he had so carefully constructed lay bare before me. Declare me mentally incompetent under the guise of grief and age, send Kevin to a state facility, and remove Tim from the home, effectively erasing the pillars of our family and seizing the fortune for himself. I felt a single tear trace the line of my cheek, not born of sadness, but of moral indignation, a righteous fury that burned through every fiber of my being. I rose slowly, clutching the papers to my chest, feeling the weight of both their contents and the responsibility they represented. I glanced through the window and saw Greg on the patio, swirling wine in a glass with the casual arrogance of a man who believed he had already won. The image of him, so relaxed and unaware, fueled the fire that had been simmering quietly within me for weeks. I realized then that the time for waiting, for cautious observation, was over. The quiet patience that had protected my son, that had shielded Tim, had served its purpose. Now, action was required. I returned to the house, carrying the evidence, every step deliberate, every breath steadying the storm of emotion within me. Kevin stirred as I passed his door, opening his eyes slowly, the faintest hint of a smile forming on his pale face. "Everything will be okay, my love," I whispered, pressing a hand gently to his arm. "We are stronger than anyone who tries to tear us apart." Tim nudged my leg, his fur warm under my hand, and I felt the solidarity of our small, unyielding family. As I prepared a simple tea for myself, I allowed myself a brief moment of reflection. Greg had underestimated us, as he always did. He had underestimated the quiet intelligence of a dog who sensed deceit, the enduring spirit of a boy who had already survived storms and sickness, and the unwavering resolve of a mother who would not stand by while her family was dismantled. Every misstep he had made, every assumption of weakness, was now in my hands to turn against him. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. I looked out at the yard, where Tim stood sentinel, and felt a deep, grounding peace wash over me. The act of playing the fool had been necessary, a mask worn to draw out the truth. It had worked. I knew now the full scope of Greg's malice, and the clarity of that knowledge allowed me to channel my anger into purpose rather than despair. I finally sat down with Kevin later, brushing his hair back from his forehead, feeling the subtle warmth returning to his skin, and I knew that our family was unbroken. Tim lay beside him, chest rising and falling in time with the boys, a living testament to loyalty, resilience, and protection. In that moment, I understood something profound. Strength is not always loud, nor is it always violent. Sometimes, it is the quiet act of watching, of waiting, of knowing when to move, and then moving with precision born of love. As the sky deepened into evening, the world outside fading into a muted palette of winter, I looked toward Greg, still on the patio, still smiling with oblivious arrogance, and I allowed myself a slow, steadying breath. The pieces were in place. The game was no longer about survival. It was about justice, about protecting what mattered most. And I felt, with a clarity that touched the very core of my being, that we would prevail. Not through malice, not through revenge alone, but through the unyielding power of family, loyalty, and the quiet intelligence of those who love without hesitation. I stroked Tim's fur again, feeling the strength of our bond, and whispered, "Soon, Tim. Soon, they'll see what happens when they underestimate us." The dog's eyes met mine, unwavering, unflinching. I knew he understood, and together we would stand, guardians of a family that no greed could ever dismantle. The day I decided to call the family meeting, the sunlight spilled lazily across the living room, highlighting the dust motes that danced like tiny sparks of life. I could feel the weight of anticipation pressing gently against my chest, a mix of hope, anxiety, and the quiet thrill of strategy. Kevin was sitting in his wheelchair by the window, sunlight warming his face, and for the first time in weeks, I noticed the hint of color returning to his cheeks. He was healing, slowly but undeniably. Tim lay stretched at his side, eyes half closed but alert, as though sensing the importance of the moment, knowing instinctively that what would happen today could change everything. I called Greg into the room with as much neutrality as I could muster, keeping my voice soft and even, concealing the sharp edge beneath it. He arrived, immediately scanning the room as if looking for signs of weakness, adjusting the cuff of his expensive shirt, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He thought he had me figured out, the frail widow, the woman distracted by sentiment and illness, but he was wrong. I cleared my throat, drawing his attention. "I've been thinking," I began, letting my voice tremble faintly. The delicate quiver I had cultivated over weeks of pretending to be weaker than I was. "I think it's time to rewrite the will, to simplify things, for you." Greg's eyes widened slightly, that familiar glint of greed igniting within them, shining brighter than the sunlight bouncing off his watch. He moved closer, leaning forward, voice laced with excitement he could barely contain. "Simplify things? For me?" he asked, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Yes, I can handle that. Whatever you need, dear, I'll help." I nodded slowly, letting the pretense of confusion soften my expression. Then I added, almost as an afterthought, "But to access the full trust fund immediately, I've been told we need to show that the family is expanding and happy, that the bonds are strong." My voice wavered just enough to sound earnest, almost pleading, as if this requirement were a burden on both of us. Greg's eyes lit up fully this time, the spark of avarice turning into a flame. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands together. "Of course! A demonstration of unity, of course. I can arrange that," he said, voice brimming with self-satisfaction. "A gala, perhaps? A celebration. Show everyone the strength of our family. That's what they'll want." I allowed a faint smile to cross my lips. He had taken the bait entirely. He thought this was his coronation, a display of triumph in a game he believed he was winning. He didn't know that Kevin and Tim were my co-conspirators in this silent war, that every plan I laid out had the unwavering support of two beings who understood loyalty in a way Greg could never hope to. Over the next days, Greg threw himself into preparations with reckless abandon. Invitations were sent, caterers contracted, decorations ordered, all charged to his own credit cards, under the assumption that the trust would reimburse him. He pranced through the rooms, arranging tables, sampling menus, discussing centerpieces with florists as if he were curating his own victory. He didn't notice my quiet observation from the corners, the subtle notes I took, the small checks I performed to ensure the plans he believed secret were already known to me. Meanwhile, Kevin's strength grew in increments too small for the untrained eye to notice. The placebos I had substituted worked perfectly. He regained energy, his mind sharp, his subtle cues, fingers squeezing mine in a chair, a raised eyebrow, a whisper allowing us to communicate beneath Linda's notice. We became a silent team, the three of us, the widow, the son, and the dog. Tim continued his constant vigilance, moving through the house with a careful, deliberate precision, positioning himself strategically wherever Greg might attempt to act unobserved. As the gala drew closer, the tension in the house thickened, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. I observed Greg one afternoon, moving quietly through my bedroom, stacking my jewelry into his safe. His actions were slow, deliberate, practiced. He believed he was preparing for the moment he would leave me behind, free to claim what he thought was his by cunning and manipulation. My chest tightened, but not with fear. No, I felt something purer, more righteous. A hand slid over Tim's head as he passed, his ears flicking in response, a silent acknowledgement of the task before us. "He forgot the most important clause, Tim," I whispered, my voice low, intimate, carrying the weight of certainty. "He forgot about the charity." Tim's tail thumped against the floor, the sound solid and reassuring, a heartbeat in rhythm with my own. I looked at Kevin, whose eyes shone with a mixture of curiosity and quiet excitement. He understood, though words were not yet necessary. We were prepared, the silent pact between us as unbreakable as the bonds of blood and love that Greg could never sever. In those moments, I felt an overwhelming sense of empowerment. The house, once a stage for Greg's arrogance and manipulation, had transformed into a battleground of intellect, loyalty, and unwavering moral compass. The people he thought he could manipulate, the child, the widow, were anything but passive. Together, we had crafted a strategy that would not merely expose his greed, but affirm the strength of our family in ways he could never anticipate. Even as Greg continued to plan, oblivious, the quiet exhilaration of preparation enveloped me. I moved through the house with a calm purpose, each step measured, each glance deliberate. I checked on Kevin, ensuring his comfort, his strength, and his awareness. Tim remained at my side, unwavering, a constant reminder that loyalty often speaks louder than any spoken word. By evening, I stood at the window, watching Greg rearrange flowers on the patio, and felt a profound clarity settle over me. The gala was no longer just a party, it was the trap itself, a demonstration not of his supposed control, but of our unity, our resilience, and the inviolable bond that neither greed nor malice could ever break. I placed a hand on my heart, feeling the quiet beat of determination, and knew, without a doubt, that the moment of reckoning was near. And as I patted Tim's head one last time before turning toward Kevin's room, I whispered again, softer this time, almost to myself, "Soon, boy. Soon they will see. Nothing can touch us now." Tim's eyes met mine, steadfast, unwavering. And I knew that together, we were ready to face whatever came next, because the true power of family is invisible until it strikes. Unrelenting, from the heart. 2 days before the party, the house felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately name. The light was the same, the walls stood where they always had, but the air carried a tension that pressed against my chest. Tim sensed it before I did. He paced the hallway with his nails clicking sharply against the floor, his ears twitching at sounds I couldn't hear. When he began barking, deep, frantic, unrelenting, it wasn't his usual alert bark. It was fear. "Tim, hey," I whispered, trying to calm him, but he bolted toward the garage door and threw his weight against it. I followed, my heart already accelerating, every instinct telling me to be careful. The garage smelled of oil and cold metal. The car sat there quietly, harmless at first glance. Tim growled low, positioning himself between me and the driver's side, his body rigid, protective. I crouched and rested a hand on his neck. "What is it?" I murmured, though my voice trembled. I bent down, forcing myself to look closer. What I saw made my stomach drop so fast it felt like falling through empty space. The brake lines cleanly sliced, not rusted, not worn, cut with intention. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My mind tried to reject the image, to soften it, to turn it into something accidental. But there was no accident here. This wasn't negligence or bad luck. Someone had wanted me dead. I sat back on the cold concrete, my legs suddenly unable to hold me. Tim pressed against my side, whining softly now, as if he knew exactly what had almost happened. I wrapped my arms around him and felt his steady warmth grounding me while my thoughts spiraled. It wasn't just theft anymore. It wasn't manipulation or quiet financial betrayal hidden behind smiles and shared dinners. This was attempted murder. Greg hadn't just wanted control. He wanted me out of the way. Sooner, not later. I thought of Kevin, of the future I had promised him, of how close I'd come to leaving him alone in the world, all because I'd tried to believe in a marriage that had been rotting from the inside. My hands shook as I reached for my phone. I didn't call Greg. I didn't scream. I didn't cry, not yet. I called the police, but I was careful with my words. I reported suspicious activity, a possible attempt at sabotage, but I didn't tell them everything. Not yet. I needed clarity before chaos. After I hung up, I stared at the phone for a long time, my thumb hovering over a contact I hadn't touched in years. My late husband had given me that number shortly before his death. I'd thought it strange at the time, almost paranoid, but he'd looked at me with a seriousness that silenced my questions. If anything ever feels off, he'd said, "Call him. Promise me." I pressed dial. The forensic accountant answered with a calm, measured voice, as if he'd been expecting this call all along. I explained what had happened, not just the breaks, but the will, the charity, the pressure, the unease that had been building quietly in my chest for months. There was a pause on the line. Then he said gently, "I think it's time you understood what your husband really built." We met the next morning. Papers spread across the table, documents I'd signed years ago without fully grasping their weight. As he spoke, something inside me shifted, slowly at first, then all at once. The charity mentioned in the will wasn't a generic organization. It wasn't symbolic or vague. It was precise, deliberate. A foundation my late husband had created quietly, almost invisibly, dedicated to victims of domestic fraud. Families destroyed from within. Spouses betrayed not by strangers, but by the people they trusted most. My breath caught as the accountant slid one document toward me. "There's a clause," he said softly. "A contingency. If I formally acknowledged that the unity of our family had been broken by Greg's actions, financial abuse, deception, intent to harm the inheritance wouldn't vanish. It wouldn't be frozen or lost. It would transfer, every cent straight into the foundation. And you," he added, meeting my eyes, "are the chairman of the board." The room went silent. I stared at the words on the page, tears blurring the ink. All this time, I'd believed the money was a leash around my neck, something I had to pretending to enduring, sacrificing myself piece by piece. I thought saving the marriage was the only way to save our future. But the truth was devastatingly simple. I didn't need to save the marriage to save the fortune. I needed to destroy the marriage to save the family. A strange calm washed over me, not relief, not joy, but clarity. The kind that comes after grief has burned through denial and left nothing but truth behind. My late husband had known. Somehow, he'd known the danger might come from inside our home, and he'd built me a way out, a shield, a second chance. That night, I went home and sat with Kevin at the kitchen table, watching him talk about his plans, his dreams, his quiet hope for a life that felt safe. Tim lay at our feet, head resting on my shoe, a silent guardian. I realized then that this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. Painful, yes. Terrifying, but also honest. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't bracing myself to survive. I was preparing to stand up to choose truth, to choose protection, to choose a future built on integrity instead of fear. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the shock and sorrow, a small, steady strength began to grow. The night of the gala arrived like a wave, sweeping over the house with lights, laughter, and the soft murmur of polite conversation. The doors opened and the town's elite streamed in, dressed in silks, sequins, and tailored suits, their faces polished with expectation and curiosity. They didn't know the tension that simmered beneath the chandeliers, beneath the glittering table settings and the carefully arranged flowers. They were unaware that the night they thought would be a celebration of wealth and prestige would instead witness the unveiling of truth. Greg was a vision of controlled charm, as always. He wore a dark suit that clung perfectly to his frame, his hair immaculately styled, a practiced smile dancing on his lips. Linda clung to his arm just enough to seem proper, though her eyes darted around with calculated vigilance, a faint trace of worry betrayed in the set of her jaw. The sight of them together, so polished, so composed, made my stomach tighten. This was the moment that could break him, the stage that could reveal everything. Tim stood at my side, calm, alert, his dark eyes sweeping the room, every hair on his body a silent warning. He had known for weeks that tonight would matter, and he understood in ways no human could how to protect what was ours. Kevin was wheeled into the room with a practiced frailty. His chest rose and fell slowly, his hands resting lightly in his lap. He smiled faintly, eyes half closed in a careful performance, and I felt the warmth of pride swell in my chest. He was strong beneath the act. He knew the role he had to play, and he played it with courage I could only admire. Our secret communication, subtle squeezes of the hand, the occasional tilt of his head remained intact. We were a silent team, united in the truth, and no observer, no matter how discerning, could read the quiet language we shared. Greg cleared his throat and raised a glass, the soft clink of crystal ringing through the hall. To family, he began, voice smooth, projecting a warmth that felt rehearsed. To loyalty, to love, and to the joys we share. He gestured to Kevin, and to my wonderful wife, whose grace under challenge is unmatched. You see, I have borne a burden, but one made lighter by the support of our family. His gaze landed on me, a flicker of triumph in his eyes, as if he believed he had convinced everyone that his words were sincere. He smiled, showing teeth that gleamed under the chandelier lights, and I felt a quiet shiver run through me, not fear, but anticipation. I rose from my seat, smoothing the fabric of my gown, and took the microphone. My hands were steady, my voice calm, though inside a storm of resolve and emotion pulsed. I looked out at the crowd, the same faces that had judged, whispered, and speculated, and then down at Tim, sitting proudly at my side, his presence a tether to the truth. The dog had been my constant, my silent witness, and now, in this moment, he was my ally in plain sight. Greg speaks of love, I said, my voice carrying across the room, rich and clear, drawing eyes and ears toward me. But real love is loyalty. And loyalty is something my dog understands better than my husband. The room fell silent. Conversations stilled mid-laugh, glasses paused mid-air. I let my words linger just long enough to let the tension settle in, letting every syllable land where it needed to. Truth against deception, justice against greed. I motioned subtly with my hand. The waiter, moving through the crowd with practiced grace, approached Greg with a silver platter, What he carried looked ordinary at first, a simple envelope, but the timing, the weight, the presentation were everything. Greg's eyes flicked to me, and he laughed lightly, assuming it was a gift, a thoughtful addition to the evening, perhaps from some guest wishing to curry favor. "Ah, how charming," he said, his voice a little too loud, laughter edging the words. "I wonder who?" He broke off mid-sentence as he tore open the envelope. The color drained from his face in an instant, leaving his skin ash-gray under the chandelier light. His hands trembled ever so slightly as he read the contents, though no one could see the depth of his panic but me. The carefully concealed documents, the legal declarations, the eviction notices, the exposure of his schemes, lay revealed in front of him. A bead of sweat slid down his temple. This can't be," he stammered, eyes flicking around the room, hoping for an ally, for a miracle, for someone to make this all vanish. But the silence was deafening, unbroken except for the soft, steady breathing of the dog at my side, the faint shuffle of guests adjusting in their seats, and the weight of truth pressing down like a hand on Greg's chest. Tim's low growl resonated through the floorboards. He stepped forward, just enough to position himself protectively beside me, ears pricked, teeth bared in a silent, undeniable warning. Greg froze, instinctively recognizing the threat he had underestimated. The nurse, Linda, froze as well, her face paling as she realized the night's choreography had spun entirely out of her control. I took a slow breath, letting my composure radiate through the microphone. "Tonight," I said, voice unwavering, "is not about wealth or appearances. It is about truth, loyalty, love that protects rather than betrays, and tonight, that truth has a voice." Greg's lips trembled, a feeble attempt at denial, but he could no longer control the narrative. The room, once full of polite whispers and clinking glasses, now hummed with tension. Every eye was on him, on me, on the silent witness at my side. Tim. I felt Kevin squeeze my hand lightly, a small affirmation that we had done this together, that our unity had never been stronger. And as I looked down at Tim, his dark eyes shining with unwavering focus, I understood that this was more than a moment of triumph. It was a testament to patience, planning, and the quiet power of family that could never be broken, no matter how greed or cruelty tried to intervene. And in that charged, silent space, with all eyes upon us, I realized that the gala, what Greg had believed would be his crowning victory, had become our stage of vindication. And we, the widow, the son, and the dog, had claimed it with dignity, courage, and unwavering love. Greg's face contorted as he scanned the papers I had orchestrated to reach him at the gala. The room had gone quiet, the polite murmurs of the guests replaced by the sound of his rapid breathing and the soft shuffle of his trembling hands. His eyes widened with disbelief, then narrowed with fury, scanning each line as if he could erase the words with sheer will. But the legal reality was immutable. This was not just a divorce filing, carefully framed to remove me from control. This was far more a document that stripped him of everything. He thought he owned and placed him entirely outside the bounds of power he had sought to wield. "You can't kick me out," he bellowed, his voice cracking as it reverberated through the grand room. "I own half this house. Half. Everything." The words tumbled from his mouth, desperate and loud, a man unraveling before his peers. I could see the red creeping into his face, veins standing out against the pale skin of panic, and I felt a small pang not of sympathy, but of recognition of the man he thought he was. Greg had always been skilled at appearances, at weaving a world where his charm masked his cruelty. But appearances were powerless against truth. I lifted the microphone slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room upon me, but my hands were steady, my voice calm. "Actually," I said, letting the words stretch deliberately, savoring the precision of timing, "you don't." The room collectively inhaled. Murmurs rose and fell as reality began to settle like snow on the shoulders of the gathered guests. I allowed a pause, long enough to let the magnitude sink in, long enough for the guests to understand the depth of Greg's miscalculation. He turned toward me, mouth opening and closing, words failing him. I saw fear flicker there, brief, lightning quick, before it was replaced by disbelief and anger. The truth, the twist, was absolute. The house had never been in my name. My late husband, with foresight only he could have possessed, had placed the deed into a trust dedicated not to me, not to wealth, but to the care of Tim, our husky. As long as Tim lived, the house legally belonged to the trust. I was merely the caretaker, the steward, the one who protected what could not protect itself. Greg had been living in a doghouse, a reality I could not wait to see him confront fully. The guests began to murmur, faces reflecting shock, awe, and an increasing sense of justice being served. I could see the slow realization dawning on them. The man who had paraded his wealth, mocked compassion, and plotted to dismantle a family for greed was now powerless, exposed, stripped of pretense. Greg's desperation turned into violence. He lunged toward me, hand raised as if he could physically reclaim what he had already lost legally. But Tim reacted with instincts honed by loyalty and love. My sweet, fluffy husky, usually gentle and playful, snapped into protection mode. A low, menacing growl rolled from his chest, echoing through the room like a warning bell. His teeth flashed as he pinned Greg against the wall, forcing him into immobility. Tim's eyes, dark and unyielding, met mine with quiet affirmation. The family he loved was safe, and he would defend it with every ounce of strength. Linda, realizing the night had shifted catastrophically, attempted to slip quietly toward the back exit. Her movements were cautious, almost furtive. But the police, positioned just as I had arranged, intercepted her before she could vanish. The facade of civility and care she had maintained crumbled in an instant. Her face, pale with fear, reflected the same betrayal Greg now faced, and she realized, far too late, that her schemes had been anticipated, observed, and ultimately thwarted. Greg, pinned by Tim's sudden and ferocious defense, thrashed weakly, his voice rising in panic and rage. "You can't. This isn't real. This is impossible," he shouted, his words tumbling into the stunned silence of the room. Every eye was on him. Every ear caught his panic-stricken, impotent declarations. I stepped forward calmly, letting the audience absorb the contrast. My composure versus his chaos, my loyalty versus his greed. I spoke again, softly, but with authority that carried to the edges of the hall. This house belongs to the trust. Tim is its living guardian, its heart, and I am entrusted with protecting him. You have been a guest here, Greg, a guest in our lives, our home, and you have abused that privilege. Tonight, that ends. He struggled, but Tim held firm, a blur of fur, growls, and steady strength. Refusing to release the wall of legal and instinctive protection he had erected around me and Kevin. I could see the first tears glisten in Greg's eyes, not remorse, not grief, but the dawning comprehension of his absolute defeat. Kevin, seated but no longer frail, watched quietly, the faintest smile brushing his lips. He had been part of the plan, and he understood now that his strength was not merely physical, but moral. His eyes met mine, and in that glance, the silent dialogue we had practiced for weeks spoke volumes. We were safe. We were whole. The family we had protected through patience, cunning, and unwavering loyalty was intact. The guests, witnessing every detail, gasped collectively, some whispering, some staring in disbelief, but all aware that justice, quiet, patient, and inevitable, had been served. The room had transformed from a stage of pretense and arrogance into a tableau of truth, loyalty, and moral reckoning. I placed a gentle hand on Tim's head, feeling the steady pulse beneath my palm. "You've done well, boy," I murmured softly. "You've protected what matters." Tim rested his head against my hand, eyes bright, ears flicking in acknowledgement. A silent celebration shared only between us. Greg's voice had diminished to frantic muttering, each word less coherent than the last. Linda was in custody. The police quietly began processing, the room slowly returning to its normal rhythms, but nothing would ever feel ordinary again. In that charged, quiet aftermath, I realized that the house, the home, and the family had been tested in ways I never could have anticipated. And yet, as I stood there, Tim at my side, Kevin watching, I felt the first warm, unshakable thread of relief, hope, and triumph. The invisible, unspoken truth that guided us through betrayal, greed, and danger had revealed itself. Family is more than walls or ownership. It is loyalty, love, and protection, unwavering even in the face of the most calculated malice. And as I looked out at the guests, their expressions a mixture of shock and admiration, I understood that tonight, justice had a voice, and it was ours. The aftermath of the gala felt surreal, like stepping out of one life and into another, though the chaos still lingered in the air, thick as a storm about to settle. Police officers moved with quiet efficiency, guiding guests to safety while securing the evidence that had been painstakingly collected. Linda, still pale and trembling, was handcuffed near the grand staircase, her eyes wide with the realization that her carefully constructed lies had crumbled. The high heels that had clicked confidently across the marble floors now felt like shackles. The mask of the professional nurse she had worn had dissolved into nothingness. She mumbled protests, but there was no one to hear her, no sympathetic ears, only the undeniable authority of the law that had finally caught up with her deception. Greg, on the other hand, was a storm in human form. His face was flushed, veins standing out like cords under the surface of his skin. As the officers placed him under arrest, he thrashed weakly, fists pounding the air, his voice rising to a desperate, accusing crescendo. "You're a crazy old bat. You'll be broke without me," he shouted, the words more pitiful than threatening. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, now darted around the room with panic, searching for an escape that did not exist. He had miscalculated in every possible way, the loyalty of those around him, the foresight of my late husband, the cunning patience of a mother protecting her son, and the unyielding instincts of a husky who had never let him forget his place. I stood quietly on the porch, the shawl around my shoulders heavy but comforting, like a familiar embrace. The cold wind brushed against my cheeks, but it did not chill me. It only sharpened the clarity of the moment. Kevin stepped forward, releasing the subtle hold he had kept on the arm of his wheelchair. The moment he straightened, revealing the full strength that had been quietly returning day by day, I felt a swell of pride and relief that washed over me in waves. My son was whole again, resilient, and ready to claim his place beside me. The act of weakness he had maintained for the gala was behind us, but the courage that had allowed him to endure it, to communicate with subtle glances and gentle hand squeezes, remained the true measure of his spirit. "I might be old, Greg," I said, my voice carrying across the snow-dusted driveway, calm and unwavering, every syllable deliberate. "But I have my son, my dog, and my dignity." I paused, letting the words linger in the cold night air. Each word carried the weight of years of grief, and of the moral clarity that had guided every decision since Greg had first shown his true nature. And thanks to the clause you never bothered to read, the foundation now controls the assets. I just hired Kevin as the CEO. The words landed like stones, solid and immovable, each one a testament to foresight, justice, and unwavering love. The guests watched from the windows, their expressions a mixture of awe, disbelief, and quiet admiration. It was a scene that would remain in their minds for a long time, not because of the wealth or the spectacle, but because of the undeniable triumph of integrity and courage. Tim, sensing the closure of the night's drama, lifted his head toward the sky and howled, a long, resonant sound that carried over the snow-covered lawn. It was a howl of victory, of protection fulfilled, and of justice served. The snow began to fall again, lightly, covering the driveway and washing away the last footprints of Greg's trespasses. Each flake a silent testament to renewal, cleansing, and the quiet peace that follows resolution. I stepped closer to Kevin, letting him feel the warmth of my presence, the steady reassurance that we had endured everything together. "We did it," I whispered, not just to him, but to the night, to the house, to the husky who had never wavered. Tim nuzzled my hand, eyes shining with the same quiet intelligence that had guided us through every danger, every lie, every moment of fear. It was a shared understanding. We had protected our family, our home, and the moral compass that had guided every action. The snow continued to fall, soft and steady, blanketing the world in a quiet hush. The chaos of the evening, the deceit, the threats, the betrayal was behind us now. In its place was the gentle rhythm of life restored. The lights inside the house glowed warmly, reflecting off the snow, illuminating faces filled with relief, pride, and a quiet sense of accomplishment. Kevin leaned into me, and I felt the strength of his body and spirit as though it were a tangible thing, grounding me, filling the spaces where fear and doubt had once lingered. I took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs, feeling the tension dissolve with each exhale. This was more than a victory over Greg, more than a legal triumph over his schemes. It was the reaffirmation of what mattered most: family, loyalty, love, and the courage to protect them even when the world seemed poised against you. Tim nudged my hand again, a gentle reminder that he had been my partner in every sense, not just a witness, but a participant, an active guardian of our truth. As the night settled, the house became a sanctuary once more. The snow muffled the world outside, leaving only the quiet companionship of mother and son, of caretaker and husky, of a family whose bond had been tested and had emerged unbroken. I looked at Kevin, then at Tim, and finally out across the snow-covered driveway, feeling a profound sense of peace. The footprints of deceit had been erased, the shadow of Greg's greed dissolved, and the light of justice and resilience shone brighter than ever. And in that serene, snow-blanketed moment, I knew that no wealth, no threat, and no cruelty could ever sever the ties that truly bound us. We had endured, we had persevered, and we had emerged not just victorious, but stronger, wiser, and more deeply connected than ever before. The howl of Tim echoed once more into the night, carrying with it the message of triumph, loyalty, and an unbreakable family. Spring had arrived quietly, like a gentle breath after a long, tumultuous winter. The snow that had clung stubbornly to the edges of the driveway and garden had melted entirely, revealing the green, tender blades of grass that Tim loved to chase and dig into. The world felt renewed, softer, and yet richer in texture, as though each petal, each leaf, each blade of grass had absorbed the tension, fear, and pain of the past months, and was now offering a promise of calm and life. I could hear the distant chirping of birds, their songs delicate and unhurried, harmonizing with the quiet crunch of Tim's paws on the fresh grass. Every sound was a note in a melody of healing, a testament to the life we had fought so fiercely to protect. Kevin had changed in ways both subtle and profound. His body, once frail and tethered to machines and medications, now radiated the vitality of health and purpose. He moved with confidence, his shoulders straight, his hands steady, and his eyes bright with the knowledge that he was no longer just a survivor of cruelty, but a protector in his own right. The foundation, now under his guidance, had become a beacon of hope, a tangible manifestation of justice and care for families who had endured the kind of manipulations and predatory behaviors that Greg had tried to inflict upon us. Every phone call he answered, every meeting he held, was infused with the same quiet intensity and compassion he had shown in those early, fragile days of recovery. He was not just managing finances or policies, he was shaping lives, extending the protective shield we had built around ourselves to those who needed it most. I sat on the porch, wrapped in a soft shawl that smelled faintly of lavender, a cup of steaming tea warming my hands. The house was tranquil, almost impossibly so after the chaos that had once threatened to consume it. The walls no longer echoed with whispers of deceit or the clatter of hurried, malicious plans. Instead, there was space for reflection, for laughter, for the quiet, unhurried rhythms of life finally restored. Tim lay nearby, chewing contentedly on a bone, his tail sweeping the porch floor with gentle, satisfied thuds. The sight of him, relaxed and happy, filled a corner of my heart that I hadn't realized had been tense for years. In this new season, there was peace, a deep, enduring peace that no wealth, no greed, and no malicious intent could ever disturb again. As I sipped my tea, I found myself thinking of all the small moments that had led us here, the careful watching of Greg, the swapping of Kevin's pills, the subtle cues that had allowed us to communicate when words were too dangerous, and the silent vigilance of Tim, whose loyalty had never wavered. Justice, I realized, was not only about retribution or punishment. It was about the preservation of dignity, the safeguarding of love, and the quiet assurance that those you care for can sleep without fear. Each of these lessons had been carved into the landscape of our lives with the precision of lived experience. And now they lay before us as the soft, fertile ground of a new beginning. I looked across the driveway where Greg's car had once sat, a symbol of entitlement, arrogance, and disruption. The spot was empty now, sunlight falling gently across the pavement, highlighting the absence without casting a shadow of regret. I felt no bitterness, no desire for vengeance, only relief. Relief that the threat was gone, that the house, the family, and the principles we held dear were intact. The struggle had refined us, revealed our strengths, and perhaps most importantly, allowed us to reclaim the peace that had been threatened for so long. Tim shifted slightly, resting his head on my lap, his warm eyes meeting mine with quiet understanding. I ran my fingers through his fur, feeling the soft thickness that had always been a source of comfort and reassurance. "We did good, boy," I whispered, my voice carrying the weight of everything we had endured. "We did good." Tim nuzzled closer, his small, steady heartbeat against my hand, a reminder that the bond we had forged through adversity was unbreakable. A tether of loyalty, love, and mutual protection that would endure far longer than any challenge we could face. Kevin joined us on the porch, leaning against the railing with a serene smile. "Mom," he said softly, his voice carrying the warmth and confidence of a man who had reclaimed both his life and his purpose. "Everything we've done, it matters. We're helping people who need it, and that's real victory." I nodded, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes, not from sorrow, but from the fullness of pride and quiet joy. We had been tested in fire and emerged not just unbroken, but stronger, wiser, and more connected than ever. The garden smelled faintly of spring blossoms, and the breeze brought the scent of earth and new beginnings. I breathed it in deeply, letting it fill every corner of my mind and heart. The house, the foundation, Kevin and Tim, these were the living reminders that love, integrity, and vigilance were far more valuable than any fleeting wealth or shallow allegiance. We had built something lasting, something true, and now Finally, we could enjoy it without fear, without pretense, and without compromise. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the porch and illuminating Tim's sleek fur, I felt the enormity of the journey behind us and the promise of the path ahead. Spring was not just a season. It was a reflection of the resilience of our family, a testament to the strength of our unity, and a symbol of renewal that could withstand any winter. And so, with Kevin at my side, Tim resting peacefully on my lap, and the world quiet and safe around us, I allowed myself to fully embrace the moment, the culmination of endurance, courage, and unwavering loyalty. Life had tested us, but it had also rewarded us, teaching that the true measure of wealth is love preserved, peace protected, and justice quietly served. If you've been moved by our story and want to follow more tallies of resilience, courage, and triumph, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Together, we can celebrate the victories that come from loyalty, love, and standing up for what truly matters.